and welcome back to another episode as we look into 3 forgotten murder cases. 1. The murder of Rose Arnold in Surrey Hills, Australia. Blood smeared across the glass window as George Rose looked inside. The small bedroom on the other side was a complete mess. Furniture was knocked over, books and picture frames were scattered, and there was blood everywhere. It splattered across the walls and ceiling. On the bed, the once white sheets were soaked bright red, and a twisted, lifeless woman lay there. George noticed a man in the corner of the room, leaning out the window and staring into the backyard. He was covered in blood too. He was smoking a white cigarette that was stained red. With each puff, the cigarette glowed as he inhaled deeply. "Richard!" George shouted. "Why did you do this in my house?" The man turned slowly, taking another deep drag from the cigarette. He raised his hand, palm open, toward George. He smiled, but beneath his blood-stained grin, there was a huge, deep cut that ran from one ear to the other on his throat, bleeding heavily. When he exhaled, the smoke didn't come from his mouth. Instead, it bellowed out from the gaping wound. On the evening of March 28, 1906, the house at 66 Nixon Street in Surrey Hills became the site of a brutal and shocking murder. When the police arrived around 6:50 p.m., they found a room that looked like a scene from a horror movie. In the first-floor bedroom, the mutilated body of Rose Arnold, a woman in her 20s, lay among the chaos. Next to her was Richard Riley, suffering from a deep wound. The room clearly showed signs of a fierce fight. At 7 p.m., Richard was quickly rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital, while Rose remained in the bed until the coroner arrived at 8:45 p.m. Detectives learned that the suspect, Richard Riley, was a resident of the house and a tenant of Mr. George Rose. George lived there with his wife and their 2-year-old child. According to George, Richard had moved into Rose's room just a few weeks prior. Rose Arnold had lived there since November, but she moved out when she got a job at a hotel in Woolloomooloo. During that time, Richard often visited her. That evening, Richard and Rose returned home together around 6:10 p.m. They seemed happy, laughing and playing with George's small child. Richard went upstairs to his room while George and his wife offered Rose some tea. However, she decided to go upstairs to see Richard first. She ran up the stairs, but moments later, George and his wife heard screaming. "Help!" and "Miss Rose, call the police! Murder!" They quickly ran upstairs but froze when they heard 2 gunshots from the bedroom. The sudden silence that followed made Miss Rose uneasy, and she decided to go back downstairs to comfort their frightened child. George pounded on the bedroom door, but there was no answer. In panic, he went around to the balcony to look through the window into the bloody room. What he saw was horrifying, and he quickly took his wife and child out of the house to go to the Surrey Hills police station on Bourke Street. When they returned, they found a crowd of neighbors gathering in the front of the house. Suddenly, several more gunshots echoed from inside, causing everyone to gasp in shock. It was half an hour before the police finally arrived. Doctors worked hard to help Richard Riley, and after he stabilized, detectives came to interview him in the hospital. Because the deep cut in his throat had damaged his windpipe and vocal cords, he couldn't talk. Instead, he asked for a pencil and a notepad. With these, he wrote a chilling message that would shock the nation. "I die. I am satisfied. My love I kill. Dick Riley. New York. My real name is E. Sexton." After mentioning his sister living in England, he continued, "I am a bad man, but I love my girl, Rose Arnold." When a doctor asked if he had shot himself, Richard wrote, "I try a lot, but I fail, and then I cut my throat, I fire two at her, and then fail. I cut. I walk about. I don't know how, but I am bad. Richard Riley was believed to have come from America, arriving in Australia on the RMS Sonoma, where he worked as a kitchen cook. The inquest into Rose's death was postponed until May to allow Richard to recover. A long line of witnesses shared their stories, helping to build a clearer picture of Richard and Rose's relationship and the events that led to the tragic murder. Many important moments happened at the former Lincoln Hotel on Forbes Street and Cathedral Street in Woolloomooloo. This was where Richard often visited Rose while she worked as a barmaid. She affectionately called him "my boy," suggesting they were in a romantic relationship. However, Richard was very jealous and became violent when he saw her talking to other men. At one point, he threatened to harm her with a bottle, and another time, he pulled out a gun and threatened to shoot a customer who was speaking with her. Eventually, Rose decided to end the relationship, and Richard learned that she was seeing someone else. When Richard confronted Rose about this, he convinced her to come to his room at 66 Nixon Street to collect some of her things. Doctors then explained the injuries found on both Rose and Richard. Rose had a deep cut on her throat, measuring 4 inches long and reaching down to her spine. Her fingers and palms were cut to the bone, showing she had fought desperately to defend herself. She also had a bullet wound in her face and another in her left upper arm. The bullet had passed through her arm and into her chest. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises. The medical examiners concluded that the bullet wound to her head and the cut on her throat were both fatal. Richard Riley had a bullet wound in his jaw and a similar 4-inch cut on his throat, which were both self-inflicted. Evidence suggested that he attacked Rose as she entered the room, trying to slit her throat. Rose was tall and athletic, which helped her fight back. In the struggle, she grabbed a razor, causing the blade to cut into her fingers. While trying to defend herself, Richard managed to pull out his gun and fired several shots. Some went wide, but 2 hit her at close range. After she fell, he finished her off with the razor to her throat. Afterwards, he aimed the gun at his head in a desperate attempt to kill himself. When that failed, he used the razor to cut his own throat. The pain became too much, and he stumbled around the room, bleeding heavily. He eventually reached the open window, leaned against it, and lit a cigarette. The coroner decided that Richard should stand trial for murder. There were 2 attempts to bring Richard to trial. The first was on June 12, 1906, when his lawyers argued that he was not mentally fit to stand trial. 2 government doctors testified that Richard believed Rose was still alive and claimed to see her in his dreams every night. Oddly, he had also lost his American accent and started talking with a French accent, raising many concerns. The jury declared him insane, and the judge ordered him to be sent to the Darlinghurst Lunatic Reception House until he could stand trial. In May 1907, more than a year after the murder, Richard was deemed mentally stable enough to stand trial. Witnesses and evidence were presented to the jury. The defense argued that Richard had a mental illness caused by a head injury from a few years earlier. During the trial, Richard told the jury how much he loved Rose, described his jealousy, and explained that the wounds he received as a soldier in the Boer War made him unstable. Initially, many doubted his story, but evidence later proved he had served in the military and had indeed suffered a head injury. Despite this, the jury found him guilty of murder. When he was allowed to speak, Richard launched into a rant about feeling persecuted and claimed he was forced to stay in the asylum along with English convicts. The judge sentenced him to death by hanging in Darlinghurst Prison. Hearing the sentence, Richard jumped up and shouted at the jury, "That's all you can give me? I'm done then, but if I can, I'll haunt those who've wronged me." Fortunately for him, Richard's sentence was later changed, and the New South Wales government ordered that he be kept in prison for an indefinite time. At the governor's pleasure. 2. The murder of Theresa Wilder. On Wednesday, March 10th, at about 11:30 a.m., two prisoners escaped while working at the Chinese school on Smith Street near Beretania. The escapees were 21-year-old James Majors, who was serving a 10-year sentence for second-degree burglary, and 19-year-old John Palakiko. John had recently escaped from the Schofield Barracks stockade and was transferred to Oahu prison after being caught again. He was serving a 4-year sentence for second-degree robbery. After they escaped, the two men paid 50 cents for a bus ride to Nu'uanu Valley. That night, they hid in the hills. The next day, they came down looking for food. At one point, a dog chased them, but they managed to find a coconut to eat. Later, they prowled around the Midkiff estate, where they stole 2 raincoats and a bottle of citronella. Although they returned to the hills, they hicked back down Pali Road while it was still light, hoping to find more food. They approached the Wilder estate from a natural swimming hole below it and initially thought the house was empty. After trying the windows in the bedrooms and failing to open any, they moved to the roadside of the house and noticed Miss Wilder getting ready to eat her evening meal. They returned to the windows along the house's roadside and successfully opened one in a small dressing room near the road. Since the next room was locked, Majors squeezed through a small air vent measuring 14 by 18 inches to get into the next room. He unlocked the door so Palakiko could enter the bedroom, and they began searching for valuables. Miss Wilder heard noises and came from the kitchen into the bedroom. She switched on the light and asked, "Who are you? What do you want?" Palakiko grabbed her arms and said, "Lady, we don't want to hurt you. We just want some food." Miss Wilder struggled to escape and ran to the front door, yelling to scare off her intruders. Just as she managed to open the door to the lanai, Palakiko caught her again. A struggle broke out, but the 68-year-old woman was easily overpowered. Majors pulled her to the ground and hit her in the eye. Dazed, Miss Wilder was tied up and blindfolded with towels. They then carried the unconscious woman into the bedroom. Once she started to regain consciousness, she struggled again but was hit by both men, who threw her onto the bed. Palakiko punched her twice in the chin, while Majors struck her jaw. Miss Wilder lost consciousness again and was gagged with the same towel used to blindfold her. From the kitchen, the men took some food before escaping through the same window. They spent about 45 minutes in the house. Afterwards, they stayed close to the thick bushes along the winding road, resting under a bridge on Kimo Road to eat some food and hide the leftovers. Later that night, they returned to Honolulu, near the Chinese school on Kapena Lane where they had escaped from, and stayed hidden there until Friday night, March 12th. On that day, Palakiko and Majors tried to steal a car, but the owner caught them and called the police. While waiting for the police to arrive, Majors asked for a cigarette. When he got one, he struck the owner and ran away. Palakiko wasn't quick enough and was caught and held by the owner. He was arrested at 10:30 p.m. on Friday night and sent back to Oahu prison, where he was placed in solitary confinement. On Tuesday morning, the body of Theresa Adele Wilder, known as Teddy to her close friends, was discovered by her housemaid, Mia Matayashi, and her gardener, Isabella Escalante. They arrived for work early and started to worry when Miss Wilder didn't respond, even though she had asked Escalante to come 2 days earlier than usual. The house was locked, and last week's newspaper was still scattered around the yard. After waiting for a while, Escalante crawled through a window and opened the front door for Matayashi. They found Miss Wilder laying on her bed and initially thought she was just asleep. But when they noticed the gag tied around her throat, they quickly called her doctor, who told them that she seemed to have died the previous Thursday. Dr. Morlock immediately contacted the police. The official cause of death was suffocation. Her jaw was broken and the gag made it hard for her to breathe. When they found her, she had already been dead for 5 days. The police had very few clues to work with. A car was seen parked along Pally Road near the Wilder estate from Thursday night into early Friday morning. A man was reported to have hitchhiked along Pally Road on Thursday night and was picked up near the Wilder estate. He had a torn shirt and looked very dishevelled. 2 men were seen around the Wilder estate between 5:45 p.m. and 6 p.m. on Thursday evening. Chief Police William Ho'opai stated, "Every officer, from those on foot to those on patrol, is eager to find any clue that might help us catch this criminal." The Board of Supervisors announced a $500 reward for information leading to the capture of the person responsible, and soon after, the Honolulu Chamber of Commerce raised it to $500 reward for information leading to the capture of the person responsible, and soon after, the Honolulu Chambers of Commerce raised it to $1,500. Police set up roadblocks to question drivers on Pally Road, asking if they had seen anything suspicious. They were also looking for 4 escapees from prison who might be connected to the case. By Friday, March 19th, 2 leads were eliminated. The hitchhiker with the torn shirt came to the police station and gave his statement, clearing himself of any wrongdoing. The other clue, the mysterious green car spotted near Miss Wilder's home, was also found to be unrelated. The green car was the closest anyone came to discovering Miss Wilder's body on the night of her murder. The car had broken down, and 2 women inside wanted to go into the house to use the phone. However, one of the men in the car told them he would hitchhike into town to borrow a car instead. The woman and the other man sat in the car for about 2 hours, while just 50 feet away, Miss Wilder's body lay undiscovered. Then the breakthrough in the investigation came when an officer recovered 2 raincoats from a hideout used by Palakiko and Majors. Palakiko recognized the raincoats as those stolen from the Midcliffe estate, which was located near the Wilder estate. He confessed to breaking into several homes, including Miss Wilder's, saying they were just searching for food. At this point, he didn't realize that he was partly responsible for the death of the 68-year-old widow, Teresa Wilder. The police took him back to her home to reenact what happened the previous Thursday night. In the meantime, a car was stopped at a roadblock at Kokai and Kalanianaole highways. The driver claimed the man in the back seat was a hitchhiker who had asked for a ride from here. The officer noticed a suspicious bundle at the man's feet and began to question him. Suddenly, the man reached for his hip pocket, and the officer, fearing he was about to pull out a weapon, yanked him out of the car. The man briefly broke free, took out a bottle from his pocket, uncorked it, and drank the contents. The officer slapped the bottle from his hand, and he collapsed. The man was identified as James Majors, the escaped convict they had been searching for. It was discovered that the bottle contained iodine. He was taken to the first aid station in Kanohe, where they pumped his stomach, and then he was sent to Queen's Hospital in Honolulu under police guard. Majors admitted that he had read about Miss Wilder's death in the newspaper and confessed to entering her home, overpowering her, tying her up, and then leaving. Far from any sort of urban legend, the true and tragic events of Teresa Adele Wilder's last moments left a deep impression on the hearts of those who knew her and on the community where she lived. 3. Murder of Luciana C. Broadwell. Not much is known about Luciana Corser Broadwell's early life. She was born on July 26, 1889, and grew up in Johnson, Vermont, with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. George Corser. In 1910, Luciana married Harry Broadwell, who was a carpenter. They moved to the city of Bear, Vermont, in 1915 and had 3 children, Doris, Hildred, and Wendell. At the time of her tragic death, Luciana was described as a petite woman, weighing about 110 pounds and standing about 5 feet 3 inches tall. She had a darker skin tone and regular face features, except for her prominent cheekbones. On the morning of May 4th, 1919, around 7:30 a.m., a man named Harold Jackson, who lived in Brookfield, Vermont, found Luciana's body. She was laying face down in a garden on Wheelock, just off North Main Street. When discovered, she was wearing only shoes, stockings, and kid gloves. Her hat, pocketbook, and Waltham watch were found nearby. The crime scene was shocking. Her hat lay 8 feet away from her body. The watch was found 13 feet from her, and her empty pocketbook was 5 feet beyond that. The watch, which had her initials LPC engraved on it, was still running when it was thrown from her body. Underneath her body were some of her clothes, including what were described as corsets, and nearby there was a pile of other clothing, some of which was torn, and the buttons were found on the ground. Investigation revealed that Luciana's hands were tied behind her back, with one of her undergarments. Another piece of her clothing and a man's white handkerchief were tied around her neck, showing clear signs that she had been strangled. The state of Vermont hired James R. Wood, Jr. from the Wood Detective Agency in Boston to investigate Luciana's murder. Wood was well known as a top detective in New England. He arrived in Bear on May 7th, the same day as Luciana's funeral, before her body was moved to Johnson for burial. At the end of his investigation, Wood remarked that the Broadwell case was one of the strongest circumstantial cases he had ever seen. When Wood got to Bear, he met with Frank C. Archibald, the Vermont Attorney General, and other local officials. It was quickly determined that Luciana had likely been killed at the Buzzell Hotel, and then her body was moved to the garden where it was found. Wood interviewed Harry Broadwell, Luciana's husband, because many suspected him of the crime. However, Wood soon ruled him out since Harry had a strong alibi for the night of the murder. Harry did express that he thought Luciana was sporty, hinting at concerns about her actions. Wood then zeroed in on George R. Long, a resident of Parker House. Harry had mentioned that he suspected Luciana of having an affair with someone living there. When questioned, Long initially denied ever meeting Luciana. Wood followed another lead provided by Harry. He found out that Luciana had a good friend named Grace Grimes, who had recently moved to Boston. Wood contacted Grace, and she confirmed that she regularly wrote to Luciana, with the last letter arriving on the day of the murder. In that letter, Luciana talked about meeting a lodger named George at the home of Mrs. Isabel Parker, who was known to run a brothel and host cheating parties. After returning to Vermont, Wood interviewed Isabel Parker, who admitted that Luciana had been at her house the night she was killed and had met George Long there. Evidence showed they had dinner together, and an autopsy revealed that Luciana had eaten about an hour before her death. When Wood searched Parker's house, he discovered the famous Red Book, which listed her clients, including many prominent people from Bear. Wood figured out how Parker ran her brothel. She would find out about men and women in Bear who were looking for secret affairs. For example, if she knew a man was married but interested in another woman, she would become friends with him and tell him a certain woman wanted to meet him. Then, she would invite him to her home and introduce him to that woman. This way, she brought couples together for their secret meetings, and the men would pay her for using her house. 1 week after Luciana Broadwell's body was found, Detective James R. Wood questioned George Long again. After hearing what Isabel Parker had admitted, Long finally confessed that he knew Luciana but denied killing her. Wood's investigation was crucial for the team prosecuting Broadwell's case. He discovered 2 key pieces of evidence. 1. A tire track next to the curb where Luciana's body was found. 2. The owner of the handkerchief tied around Luciana's neck. The tire track was traced back to a car that Long had rented. The handkerchief was linked to a man named Eddie Barron, who testified during Long's trial that he had given it to Long. Additionally, Wood's full interview with Long was shared with the jury during the trial. He took very detailed notes throughout his investigation. In one part of his report, he mentioned feeling disgusted and leaving Vermont for a while. He also noted that local officials thought he was crazy and believed he was chasing false leads. One memorable detail he included was about his first night in Vermont. "I worked all night on this case. I visited the spot where Luciana's body was found, checked out the Buzzell Hotel, looked at the lighting conditions, and decided that Mrs. Broadwell was not killed in the Buzzell Hotel. I returned to the hotel just before breakfast, and no one knew I had been working all night." On May 15th, George Long and Isabel Parker were arrested and taken to the Washington County Jail in Montpelier. Their arraignment took place the next day, on May 16th, where they were assigned a defense attorney named J. Ward Carver. Earl Davis represented the state. A grand jury hearing was scheduled for June 5th. During this time, it was discovered that George Long's real name was George Rath, and he had adopted the name Long after moving to Vermont. He reportedly had a long criminal history. By June 11th, both Long and Parker were indicted by the grand jury. George Long's trial began October 7th, 1919, at 9 a.m. with jury selection. By October 10th, both the prosecution and defense presented their opening statements, filling the courtroom to capacity. On October 20th, Long's second statement to the authorities was read in court. In this statement, he admitted to paying Luciana for sexual relations and also paid Mrs. Parker for providing the room. On October 24th, a witness named Daisy Luce testified that she spoke with Long on the morning Luciana's body was discovered. During their conversation, Long said, "There would be one less woman in Bear." The trial lasted a month and included testimony from 100 witnesses. In their final statements, the defense argued that Long had no reason to kill Luciana since they were intimate partners. The prosecution, however, painted Long as a monster, referring to him as a thing. They relied heavily on circumstantial evidence gathered by the Wood Detective Agency. On October 31st, the judge instructed the jury, and that afternoon, they returned with a verdict. At 3:30 p.m., the jury found George Long guilty of second-degree murder for Luciana Broadwell's death. His sentencing was set for November 5th, and he was ordered to serve a life sentence in prison. After sentencing, Long was transferred to Windsor State Prison. He appealed his case, claiming there were issues during the trial. In 1922, the Vermont Supreme Court reviewed his case and stated, "The record shows a brutal killing, clearly showing cold-hearted depravity and wanton cruelty." Long's appeal was denied. Once Long's trial was over, the focus shifted to Isabel Parker. Although she was initially linked to Luciana's murder, she was only charged with conducting a house of ill fame. Parker pleaded guilty to this charge and received a sentence of 2 to 4 years in prison. Due to her health issues, officials allowed her to stay free while she asked the governor for clemency, but her petition was denied on April 23, 1920. She began serving her sentence on April 26th and died 2.5 years later on September 5th, 1922.